When I was about 21, I lived in North London, in Kentish Town, and I used to go for walks on Hampstead Heath. I was walking back from the heath, and I saw a figure moving towards me. He was wearing a long brown cloak, which he held sort of from his inside, closed in front of him, but I could see a flash of orange underneath. And that immediately arrested my attention. So I watched him as he moved towards me, and I was deeply impressed about the way he moved. I hadn't then words to describe it to myself. The way I thought of it was that this is a really mature man. This is somebody who's self-possessed, I suppose, would be the way of putting it. I heard about the centre in Monmouth Street. I was attracted to go. I saw this figure sitting like a lion who's had his dinner and not going to eat you, but very, very relaxed, very calm, but dangerous. There was something about him that was dangerous, existentially dangerous. It's in a flash I had that experience. He had me from then on. Yeah, I was really hooked.
They used to have a Mitratar tea party, which a team of women would be invited to have tea with Bantay, but everybody was terribly shy. But Bantay cottoned on to that I like reading poetry, and although my both depth and breadth of reading is absolutely tiny compared to his, it was enough to kind of sustain a conversation. So those were. And then I very precociously asked for ordination right then. People hardly knew me. I was very, very new indeed. But I just went to ask Bantay one day without telling anybody else. And he just said, "Oh yes, I knew you were going to ask today. I'm very pleased." So my very first job was typing the Tantric Path series of lectures. So that really started a long-term sort of literary association, I suppose. Actually, 15 years later, then I found myself in Bantay's flat once a week reading to him the edited version of those very same lectures, because by then he couldn't see. And then 15 years after that, I was working with the same material and the complete works. So it feels like from the very beginning until now, there was a sort of continuity.
Actually, the first time I met Bantay was when I saw his photo on the cover of the Thousand Petaled Lotus, and those glowing orange robes, writing. And this was when I was 20, maybe 21. Whether it was just because that triggered something more archetypal, or whether it was because there was a Westerner in robes, I don't know. But that image stayed with me very, very strongly. So in a way, I was introduced to Bantay in quite a deep and profound way, just by reading that book. It was a communication of sorts.
His last talk in Nagpur, Bantay said, Nagpur need 100 order members. And I really liked that. So I remember first time I met Bantay at Madhyam Loka. I asked Bantay, do you remember in one of your talks in Nagpur, you said that Nagpur need 100 order members? And Bantay smiled and said, I do remember. And I said, Bantay, do you know now we got more than 25 order members? He smiled. So every time I met Bantay, and I would say again, now Bantay, we got 40, we got 50, and last I remember, so I said, Bantay, now I'm very happy to tell you, in Nagpur, now we have more than 70 order members. Then he had a big smile and said, few more to go.
He wasn't just like a man in isolation. I learnt he had a family, and he was still in quite good contact with that family. I learnt about his relationships with his parents. He and his mum would sit in the lounge. They'd be listening to the radio, and she wanted to listen to a more kind of ordinary, entertaining programme. And he wanted to listen to classical music, and he often got his way. And I think he looks back on that in a way that felt regret. You know, he thought she was probably sometimes quite lonely, sitting in this room, listening to music she didn't really enjoy, with a very young man or adolescent who wasn't really communicating very much. He sort of got a sense of that in his later years.
So I felt like I saw Bantay in his fastidiousness is a word that comes to mind. You know, he was quite fussy about, you know, he had very definite taste, and I'd see that sometimes, and then I'd see him in his quite humorous mood. He would tease people, and also I would sometimes just get this flash of this understanding of something of reality that was just opened my mind and heart up to something much bigger. He'd sometimes send for me and say that something he'd read in Shabda had concerned him, and would I follow it up? And I never particularly enjoyed that, because it felt like, I don't know, being sent off to check up on somebody. But actually I did it because I knew it was coming from care for the person and also for the order. And he would sometimes pick things up that had seemed quite innocent, but he would have a concern, and then when it was followed up, the concern would often be quite acute or quite apt, and then often it would lead to something, and then it would actually be really quite helpful for the person. And he got so many letters from people, letters that he got of appreciation, or somebody who was having a hard time, and he would be wanting to make sure they had support. So he once said to me he felt concerned that when he died, he worried who would have the eagle eye on the order. And I thought, eagle eye, that sounds a bit, I don't know, like Big Brother or something. But actually what he meant was somebody that could have an overview and who would pick things up out of concern.
You know, he's been a good friend. Obviously there's a very strong vertical element to our relationship. He's my teacher. But, you know, I think he says somewhere, doesn't he, you can't really teach anybody unless he's also a friend. I can't remember where I read that. I thought that interesting. It's a koan, in a funny sort of way, I think, Kalyana Mitrata is a koan, you know, over the years. You're operating on different levels.
I think what Bantay saw in me, or certainly what Bantay released in me, was my potential. Bantay had always been extremely encouraging to me, and always sort of egged me on. It was, on the one hand, extremely good and very, very inspiring just to be in close contact with somebody of that kind, but it's also a little daunting and at times a little painful in a way, because one's a bit too near the flame. And so I think I was being educated in a perspective which was not merely sort of functional but spiritual as well. Because Bantay's perspective was always unusual. I could never entirely predict, up until his dying day, how he would respond. He was always a little beyond what one expected.
What Bantay did, what Bantay contributed, particularly India, is such a big thing. We can't imagine actually without our Triratna and without Bantay's teaching. I couldn't imagine what would have happened to Buddhist people. They very strongly appreciate what Bantay did and what Bantay contributed to Buddhism in India. So that is very much in my mind. In his talk in Nagpur, that big talk at Kastujan Park, he said 2/3 of his dreams are related with India. So India was always in his heart. And we are also aware about the controversies about Bantay's past, but this didn't shake my faith in Bantay. The particular way or particular presentation of Bantay's teaching really changed so many people's life.
I did have a period when I fell out with Bantay. The connection was still strong, but the communication was difficult. It's a most painful period of my life. And that means I really understand what the Buddha says, that when he says that to be out without somebody to revere and rely upon, life is painful. Right, without something to revere and rely upon. And I revered and relied upon Bantay for 30 years or whatever, and suddenly, it's not that I didn't, but I couldn't do it so easily. I think what it really was about was a growing up in that relationship, come to terms with the fact that Bantay was both a man of exceptional vision and at the same time was a human being, not altogether sorted out, various things still to work with. And I was able to hold both of those at the same time.
But actually, he was a very kind friend to me. There was a time, I suppose about 20 years ago, when I just ran into real difficulty in my life. And he was just really very nice. He used to ring me up and come and see me. And I felt like, well, a friend in quite an ordinary sort of way. I mean, I'm aware that hundreds of people have relationships of different sorts with Bantay. I always used to feel how generous he was to give his time to so many people. I used to think, well, this isn't the only thing he could have been doing, setting up this movement. And in some ways well, it was at a cost to him. You know, I think he was very proud of it. He felt it was the major work of his life, but he also could have imagined a different life. Maybe that was something he missed. In some of his writings, he talks about how he would go down, you know, when he was living in London in the 70s, he would go down to the pub and just sort of sit and have a pint and just be among folk, being anonymous. And I sort of have a feeling that that was a side of him that he would have liked to live more, perhaps. And yet, you know, completely swept along by other forces. Extraordinary experiences in his life, and he had an extraordinary grasp of the Dharma and how to communicate it. But I think as well he was himself a learner and a Dharma practitioner. I don't feel that he ever wavered from that. And reading him, you can see how difficult that was sometimes to deal with the forces that he had within him and outside him. You know, and yet managing somehow to do it, to do so much.
And there were times, quite moving times, when he knew some of the controversy that was going on around him and what some people were saying about him or what some of his friends were saying about him. And I remember once going in and he said, can we just sit and I just hold your hand for a bit? And that's all we did in that moment, just for a few minutes. He knew I was serving him by the job that I was doing. When I became chair at Adhisthana, he knew I was really serving him. And he could see that I was doing a good job or a good enough job. And he wanted to serve me as well. So it was kind of mutual in that respect.
I think it was 1990 or late 89, I can't remember now, when Dada Rinpoche died. I think that affected Bantay quite deeply. Bantay's always had a very vivid dream life, and quite often his teachers would appear in his dreams. You know, I was starting to have dreams as well, by association. Mine were always a little prosaic, his were more interesting on the whole. But I think what is essentially was the most difficult was when he was suffering himself as well through his insomnia. That was so painful for me. And painful for him, because in a way there's not much you can do, there's not much you can offer. But in those moments where he was just awake for long periods, I did ask him what he did, and he said, well, firstly I just try and think of all my friends, and he had a lot of friends. He would think of all his friends and what they've given him, which I was really humbled by. Actually, I really just thought, that is so extraordinary when you're suffering so badly that you turn your mind to your friends, you know. His mantras were very important for him, the sadhanas. So I was there, in the 2 or 3 or 4 days with him before he died. I could read to him. I'd been reading the 100,000 songs, a new translation of the 100,000 songs of Milarepa. So when I was with him, that had been a feature of our evenings for a month or so. I actually said goodbye to him. I wasn't quite sure what was going to happen, but at 5 in the morning, the day before he went to the hospital, we sort of said goodbye, really. I think both of us knew that perhaps if we didn't take the opportunity then, that there wouldn't be an opportunity, perhaps, one never knows, does one? Before we'd left at Istana, he asked me, he didn't want to lose this mala that he had. I put that in his hand, and Sangharakshita and I, Sangharakshita had brought his case with him, so he just put it over his head. And then, yeah, maybe within not long, maybe a minute or so, he just stopped breathing. It was quite extraordinary, really. Yeah, it just seemed very, very, very still and deep. In a sense, almost quite a beautiful moment. Just this old body just being let go of.
You know, people ask me quite often if I miss Bantay. In a certain point of view, I really don't. And I kind of have wondered if that's a bit hard-hearted or something, but it doesn't feel hard-hearted. It just feels like he still feels very present in my life. But the area, the level in which I do miss him a bit is the thing about coming back from having been away somewhere and just being able to kind of tell him how things are going.
There are times I miss him. Maybe there's sort of softness that I miss, or maybe just a very encouraging Kalyana Mitra.
I think Bantay's written somewhere, the ultimate test of fidelity is death, isn't it? So I don't see there's a loss of connection, you know, at least in my own being. I don't see there's a loss of connection at all, really. But I do miss him a lot.
No doubt he'll come back. Again, he told me on one occasion that he didn't want to be reborn, and he hoped that he'd have a rest, he said. He wanted a long rest. But then he said, but there is rebirth, and I do believe in rebirth, and there is the Bodhisattva vow. And so, therefore, I will come back.
I talked to him once about his Bodhisattva ordination that he took from Dada Rinpoche, and he said it was the happiest day of his life, that it was the fulcrum moment that everything before had led to and everything since came from it. And our movement definitely came from that, because one of the Bodhisattva precepts that he took from Dada Rinpoche was to create community, was gathering Sangha.
We lot are all linked at a level beyond this life, beyond birth and death in this life, that there's something that's bound us together that will keep us together in the future. And to that extent, for instance, at times people have despaired about what's happening with the movement and so forth. I've often been able to hold on to that sense. Don't worry, it's got a much, much larger perspective than that. This is a lifetime's process, and I'm in it for those lifetimes. I'm pretty confident that I'll find Bantay, or he'll find me, and I'm pretty confident that I'll find you lot, and that we will reignite the Dhamma in the way that Bantay has taught us in whatever situation we find ourselves. I'm pretty confident of that.
I had a dream about 2 or 3 months after his death where I'm sitting with in a vast circle of Buddhists, possibly Triratna, possibly just Buddhists. And the circle's so big I can't quite see to the other end of it across from me, but there's somebody gesturing. I'm trying to work out who it is, and I realise it's Bantay. You know? And he's got, rather strangely, a half glass of red wine, and he's holding it up, toasting me. Now I realise in the dream I've got a half glass of red wine. And so we're toasting each other across this vast circle of Buddhists. There was something in that image that really went quite deep for me, the sort of joy or that sense of continuing connection on whatever level that might be.